This is CS Academy once again, one of your best online platform for prospective university students who are either writing WAEC, JAMB, or the likes. For today, we're trying to expose the secrets behind a topic called effect of changes in demand and supply on equilibrium price and quantity. I will advise you guys to stay with us. We'll be right back. Now, for students who want to understand this topic perfectly, that's effect of changes in demand and supply on equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, I want to believe that they ought to have known equilibrium points perfectly. And if you recall, this is what equilibrium point is all about. You have your price, and then you have your quantity in units, for example. Now, this will be your regular demand curve, and this is your supply curve. So we have S1, for example, X1, you have D1, D1. So this leads us to the equilibrium price, and then to the equilibrium quantity. E represents equilibrium points. Having this basic knowledge, then the students can understand this perfectly, because we're going to be taking about 16 cases. So we have 16 cases here, 12 regular cases and 4 non-regular cases. Case number 1, we'll be coming with an instruction that says increase in demand only. And when we have to put up those cases, all we need to just do is obey that instruction on this original knowledge, and then check out what the effect is after obeying the instruction. So let's consider case number 1, which says increase in what? Demand only. All right. So we establish that same diagram, and then we have our demand and supply curve. This is D1, S1, D1, S1. So I have my price in Naira, I have my quantity in units. Now, the examiner says increase in demand only. Now take note, increase in demand only also means increase in demand without a change in supply, the same meaning. The instruction says just increase your demand. Please don't forget our equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So when I have to increase my demand, increase in demand is one of the changes that occur in demand. Remember the case in change in demand, not quantity demanded now. So change in demand is like shift in demand. And shift can be left or right. If it's to the right, it represents increase. If it's to the left, it represents decrease. Now the examiner is saying, obey the instruction of what? Increasing your demand only. I'm going to do a rightward shift of the demand curve. And that gives us the second demand curve, which is D2. We have an original equilibrium point with a new demand curve and no change in supply. We're going to consider the point of interaction between the new demand curve and the old supply curve before we can analyze our changes. So this is the new equilibrium point. We trace the point of intersection or interaction to the price line and also the quantity line. And then we have 1, 1. This is the second one, which is 2. Equilibrium price has a second one, which is also 2. And then we have the interpretation. That interpretation is the effect. What can we see on the board after having the new, traces? You can see that equilibrium price went up, and that's increase. equilibrium quantity also went this way, which shows increase from 0.0. If this were to be 5, this would have probably been 10, 5, and this is also 10. So the effect from what we have in that case shows, number one, there is an increase in equilibrium price. 2, there's also an increase in equilibrium quantity. Effect, case number 1. So that ends it. If I'm going to case number 2, I just need to change the instruction. And when I change the instruction, I'll come back to obey the instruction. If this is all for case number 1. So when the examiner puts up a question like, an increase in demand without a change in supply will lead to dash. The option that will be correct in the question is the one that has an increase in both equilibrium price and quantity. Check the arrows. Case number 2. For case number 2, we do something opposite this. From increase, we change to decrease. Decrease in demand only. It means we are not going to do this shift that we had before. We're going to do the opposite of this shift. And how do we do the opposite of this shift? Let's get back to the origin. The origin of this shows that, we can take all this off, take them off, and have a situation where this diagram is reproduced, and then we have this instruction taken. Now this is what we have. Okay, let me take everything totally out so that we don't get confused. So I'm reproducing the equilibrium, and then this is S1, S1, D1, D1. Equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. And from this point, we can now obey this instruction. This instruction says we should decrease demand. And decrease in demand represents a leftward shift of the demand curve. A leftward of the demand curve goes this way. That gives us our D2, D2, and then, of course, leftward. When we have that shift to the left, we're considering the interaction between the new demand curve and the old supply curve, which gives us our second equilibrium point. You trace that interaction point to the price line and also to the quantity line. So this gives us second equilibrium price and second equilibrium quantity. What can we see? Effect now. I can see that my equilibrium price came down, reduced, while my equilibrium quantity also reduced. We just need to go back to the effect and let this reflect. What's happening to equilibrium price? Decrease. So just a slight changes in this. We have decrease in equilibrium price. What's happening to this? Also decrease. And then we'll go to decrease in equilibrium quantity. So every student who gets into the exam hall and you have a question like, and a decrease in demand without a change in supply will lead to dash. The correct option for that kind of question is a decrease in both equilibrium price and quantity. Now for case number 3, we consider a third instruction where the examiner decides to have the changes affecting both demand and supply. And then we have increase in demand and an increase in supply. No big deal. Just obey the instruction and everything will come out perfect. So we still have our quantity in units, and then check out the original status. We have D1, D1, S1, S1. And this brings about our equilibrium point, tracing it to the equilibrium price, the first equilibrium price, because we're still going to consider the effect. And then on the quantity aspect, we have equilibrium quantity 1. And that equilibrium quantity 1 and price 1 gives us a starting point before the instruction. A starting point for the instruction, let's now go to the instruction which says increase in demand first. Increase in demand, like I said earlier, is what? A rightward shift of the demand curve. And then we'll go this way. D2. Now this is where the students need to be careful. A lot of students make this mistake and I want to correct it here. When we have to consider the shift from both demand and supply, please take note of the gap between the first demand curve and the second demand curve, or the new demand curve, and ensure that you have the same gap existing on the new supply curve also. Because if you don't get that right, your interpretation will be totally wrong. It's something to note. The gap between the first and the second demand curve must be the same as the gap between the first and the second supply curve. So let's look at this gap. We also want to represent a rightward shift of the supply curve. So maybe something like this is not bad. And then we have it this way. If we have it this way, it's supply 2, supply 2. And this is the new point of, that's 2. This is the new point of intersection. We're considering the new demand curve and the new supply curve now because we have a shift in supply. In the old one, we only considered new demand curve and old supply curve because there was no shift or change for supply. Now there is a change for supply, so we can match them. New demand curve, new supply curve, point of intersection, trace it to your price axis and trace it to your quantity axis. What do you have? Equilibrium quantity 2. Equilibrium price 1 and 2 will stay on the same point. It means that the effect on price, equilibrium price is what? Constant. First effect, from what you can see, equilibrium price remained the same. So we can just say constant equilibrium price, constant equilibrium price. And then we look at the quantity. If this is 0.0, what happens? This shows an increase. So we can say increase in equilibrium quantity. Increase in equilibrium quantity. So, for a question with an increase in demand and an increase in supply will lead to dash. This is the correct option you should look for. Look out for the option that has no change in equilibrium price, which is constant equilibrium price, and then an increase in equilibrium quantity. And that will give you a perfect answer. The next case is case number 4. And for case number 4, what we need to change is the increase on both ends. Let's consider a case where we have decrease in demand and also decrease in supply. So I'm changing this to decrease, change this to decrease, and then that gives us another direction entirely. I'm going to take this diagram out so that we don't get confused. Draw it all over again for better understanding. So what do we have here? We have a new equilibrium point to start with. Nothing to be confused about. Just obey the instruction and the effect to be clear. So, a demand, supply, first demand curve, D1, S1. This is the equilibrium point because this is the meeting point. We trace it to the price line, it gives us equilibrium price 1. Trace it to the quantity line, it gives us equilibrium quantity 1. And don't forget we have to obey this instruction. The instruction we're obeying says decrease in demand. First, decrease in demand from what we understand in economics is a leftward shift in what? The demand curve. So the demand curve shifts to the left. It represents decrease. So we're not going the other way, we're going this way. And that gives us D2, D2. The other instruction says, and a decrease in supply. Decrease in supply is also a leftward for supply. Same leftward. And then we go this way. When we go this way, take note. The gap between this and this must be the same with the gap between the first supply curve and the second supply curve, like I explained earlier. So let's consider and just say this is not bad. I think that's good enough. And then we have something of this nature. So we have S2, S2. The new point of intersection is here. New supply curve, new demand curve. They meet at this point. We'll call it equilibrium point 2. Equilibrium point 2 has to be traced to the price axis, giving us equilibrium price 2 at the same point with 1. So putting an asterisk to show that it's constant, and then we'll trace it to the quantity axis. You can see that there is a decrease in this. Effects. Constant equilibrium price. And then there's a decrease in equilibrium quantity. So this is the only one that is going to change. Just convert this to decrease. What do we have? When the examiner says a decrease in demand and a decrease, please, and a decrease in supply will lead to dash. The correct option will be the option that has constant equilibrium price and a decrease in equilibrium quantity. And that gives you a perfect answer. For case number 5, we do not have anything totally different from what we have been following. All we need to do is just do a little twist the other way around. We have considered increase in demand, increase in supply. Decrease in demand, decrease in supply. Now let's twist. Let's take increase increase in demand as the first instruction, and then a decrease in supply. No big deal. Follow the instruction and everything will appear clear. So we have price in naira, we have a quantity in units, please. Don't forget the original status. We have first supply curve and first demand curve. The point of intersection gives us the equilibrium point. You trace it to the price axis, it gives you equilibrium price 1. Bring it to quantity axis, it gives you equilibrium quantity 1. And then we'll go back to obey the instruction. The examiner says we should obey the instruction that says increase in demand. Increase in demand, from what we know, is a rightward shift of the demand curve. And that produces D2, which is the second demand curve. The other instruction says, and a decrease in supply. Don't forget, increase for the first instruction. Second instruction, decrease. And that decrease will come in form of leftward shift. Don't also forget, the gap between this demand, first and second demand curve, must be the same with that of what? The first and the second supply curve. So let's consider something around here. And then we'll bring it down. So that gives us S2, S2. Combining the new supply curve and the old and the new demand curve, this will become our new equilibrium point. Don't forget, we always trace it to the price line, which gives us the new equilibrium price. Trace it to the quantity line. Everything, both of them are on the same line. It means our equilibrium quantity 2 is also here. The asterisk shows that it is constant. And that actually gives us an idea of what the effect is going to look like. So I'm putting an arrow to show the decrease in supply. What's now the effect? The effect we have from what is on the board, the diagram, is that there is an increase in equilibrium price while equilibrium quantity remain constant. So we take effect number 1. We have increase in equilibrium price. 2, we have constant equilibrium quantity. So for any question that goes with an increase in demand and a decrease in supply will lead to dash. The best option for that answer is increase in equilibrium quantity and price rather, and a constant equilibrium quantity. And whichever way the examiner tries to present this, just have this in mind and it will be correct anytime, any day. The next case we're going to take is case number 6. And case number 6 require a little adjustment. We'll just do another switch. We'll take a decrease in demand and take an increase. We take an increase in supply. An increase in supply, decrease in demand. Let's take the diagram all over again for clarity so that we don't get confused. We're going back to the origin. This is the diagram. My price in naira, let's consider that, and then quantity in units. Establish your equilibrium points. D1, D1, S1, S1. This is the equilibrium point. Trace it to the price axis, it gives equilibrium price 1. Trace it to the quantity axis, gives equilibrium quantity 1. And then we obey the instruction. The instruction says, consider a decrease in demand. A decrease in demand is a leftward shift of the demand curve, which gives us D2, second demand. Shift to the left, decrease. And then the next instruction says, and an increase in supply. An increase in supply is a rightward shift. Don't forget, the gap between D1 and D2 must be the same as the gap between S1 and S2. So if we consider something of this nature, we are going to have this, for example. We're having this, for example, and we have S2, S2. For S2, S2 and D1, D2, D2, this will be the new equilibrium points. And this equilibrium points can stay here as E2, while we have the point of intersection traced to the price axis, giving us equilibrium price 2, and then the tracing of this to the equilibrium, to the quantity line, gives us equilibrium quantity 2, shows, the aesthetic shows that we have a constant equilibrium quantity. It didn't change the same point. Knowing that this increased and this remained constant, we move to the effect. Effect number 1. Sorry, this is a decrease. Effect number 1. We have a decrease in equilibrium price and then a constant equilibrium quantity. So no big difference. It changes at this point, and the answer is correct. So you find a question that says a decrease in demand and an increase in supply will lead to dash. The correct option for that question will be something that has the effect you have on the board. Decrease in equilibrium price and a constant equilibrium quantity. And that ends it there. Hello viewers. Having taken 6 cases out of the effect of changes in demand and supply on equilibrium price and quantity, we look forward to having other 10 cases come up in our next video. But don't forget to click on the like and subscribe button, turn on your notification, and leave a comment. Thank you.